I wanted to start with just a short poem that I had sort of skipped over in Works and Days by Bernadette Mayer, Tasawasa Blues. Sky blue pink, indigo, Persian blue, lapis, cerulean, cobalt, alizarin crimson, pitchfork blue, blue denim, blue Danube, Blue Ridge Parkway, powder blue, midnight blue, black and blue, Nancy Drew's blue roadster, Babe the blue ox, bluefish, blueberries, blue point oysters, navy blue, I'm not so poor that I don't have a pourer for my pure olive oil. So I think that this is like a talismanic poem for this idea I want to just touch on and sort of dance around this idea of collage and of improvisation, and how I was sort of thinking about Joseph Cornell and Joe Brainard and how they would both go on walks through New York and find blue things, and then Bernadette did that here. And that kind of idea of collection, like a magpie poetics, of just being in the present moment. I think that's one of the things that I feel like unites the very various practices of New York school poetry. And I was very interested in the earlier talk saying how, it reminded me of the objectivists, how, every poet and the objectivists are very, very different. And I feel like New York school poets are also that way. And the first little impression I got from that was, I was thinking of shapes. Joe Brainard's I Remember, I think of as like a Venetian blind, kind of endlessly unfolding. And I also think of John Ashbery that way. I feel like each line kind of slides in and out, and you can sort of take them as a piece of a Venetian blind, but they're a very different blind. But I think of Frank O'Hara as these kind of abstract expressionist paintings, but all the shapes kind of connect with meaning and passion and feeling. And I think of Bernadette's really as writing in every way you can imagine. I feel like she has a very various practice. But I think that one of the things she does is, like she did say, write in every way you can imagine. That was one of the things she says. And her Bernadette Mayer list of experiments to me is also this kind of listing an improvisation on reading. It's like reading a specific text and then saying, what would you write after reading that thing? I hope you're familiar with Bernadette Mayer's list of experiments. It's easy to find on the internet. But this kind of, it reminds me of I Remember, there's no closure. It's a rejection of closure. It says, please add to this list. I wanted to, I made some notes. I'll just read a tiny bit from this, and then I'm going to read a little bit from the great compilation that Olivier Broussard did for Frank O'Hara. Lovers of My Orchards, the little essay I did for that, because I realized a lot of things I was trying to say are already in that piece, so I won't be able to read from that whole thing. But first, I said, in answer to the question, what do we talk about when we talk about the New York school, I'm compiling an open weave collage of quotes and associations in hope of planting seeds for further questions. So I'm just trying to make an open book for people to interject into. I'm aware that as a poet who tends to pour all of my thoughts and energy into the service of making the next poem, that I've been powerfully drawn to practices that favor this weaving of everyday presence across language. And it helps me to look at the cross-pollination of French and New York school practices as I see them, and look forward to deepening my understanding of those interaction and practices. I've long thought about the great interplay between New York school and the vast storehouses of the French millefeuille, I can't even pronounce anything, of playful, disruptive, and languorous poems walking through the many streets and avenues of the two of the culturally densest cities of the past few centuries in the Western world. The great cultural exchange that happened in the past few decades with the Fulbrights and all that, all these New York school poets got to come over here, Ron Padgett and Ashbery. That kind of interchange has been happening for a long time. And it just seems to be there's this interesting parallel play between these two cities. And I think it's really great that we're having this conference here. But the word that I kind of return to when I think of Bernadette Mayer's sonnets, which I published in 1989 with my press, Tender Buttons, and how that relates to some of Frank O'Hara's music, is this idea of the headlong, so like this headlong energy, and how it sort of goes like a subway or a metro through the landscape. The end point of the line is not paid attention to. There's just a rush of energy. And I said, why is Frank O'Hara's poetry so wonderful? I cannot read his work without wanting to write poems. It's like, to me, it's that generative feeling. And I'm going to just sketch out a few trajectories of my encounters with his work over the past few decades as a kind of home movie in my mind's eye, like Matthew was talking about, the cinematic presence of it. So Ginsberg would always talk about snapshot poetics, like haiku being like these moments, his sort of American interpretation of that. And I think Frank O'Hara's practice is more of a multidimensional filmic poetics. And his poems unfurl through high and low culture, through personal and world news, leaving nothing outside the lens of his reeling encounters with reality as the poems travel. These word films are not feature length, but they're akin to the open mode of poetic films by the likes of American filmmakers like Warren Sonbert, Abigail Child, Nathaniel Dorsky, or Jerry Heiler, otherwise known as a New American Cinema. So I think that a lot needs to be written about those parallels as well. The works have in common a non-linear joy, and they jump associatively, traveling in time and space as one does in dream or during sexual states of engagement, mind flashing to people and places all over the known and represented world. Let me skip to this. O'Hara's poetry is for me a polyamorous poetry, loving language of all registers, purporting a poetics of everyday ecstasy, a poetics of naming names. As a young poet, I would see names like Anne and Ted in his poems and want to meet them. I later found my own interlocking community, and they're part of my work too. Catullus did that too. One thing I want to note is, I think Holly Melgard and Joey, how do you pronounce his last name? Holly's partner, I never can get it in my head, but he said, this is not a New York School poem because somebody used his last name in the poem. I was like, if you use the first name, it's a New York School. When I first came to New York, I worked at the Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church. There's a plaque dedicated to Frank O'Hara in the churchyard there, and I just felt his presence very strongly there. And I love that scene in the film. I hope most of y'all have seen of him typing the poem while he's talking on the phone, and his modes of simultaneous writing appealing to helping young poets know how the imagination can jump off of anything, composing on the subway or the ferry on the way to work or during all kinds of other activities. So this poetics of during, kind of art criticism of everyday time and space. One of Bernadette Mayer's list of writing experiments from her workshops at the Poetry Project contains a like-minded articulation of this approach. Quote, write while being read to from science texts, or write while being read to by one's lover from any text. So like hearing a text in your mind and then writing at the same time, or attempt writing in a state of mind that seems least congenial. So like, there's like this onslaught, like I felt like being in Paris just now, like when I'm all jet lagged and I was walking around and like everywhere you look, there's a poem, right? It's that same kind of feeling in New York when you're just like filtering all the experience through your mind and body. And then in addition, one version of Bernadette Mayer's generative list, which there are all these different versions, says, review the statement. What is happening to me, allowing for lies and exaggerations, which I try to avoid, goes into my poems. Only now, as I reread it, Frank O'Hara's work for this essay, do I realize that this quote is actually from O'Hara's poetic statement for the New American Poetry. And it's like this interaction of reading, what would you write after reading that thing? It's just like this constant communication of community. So. That is one of the perfect descriptions of the doubleness of representation of personal realities with O'Hara's unique abilities to transform personal material into imaginative gestures and colorful, multi-layered word films. I hear this improvisatory ability as a link between O'Hara and Mayer's prosody. It calls to mind what I want to call a headlong quality. Love is a babe, and when you put your startling hand on my head or heart or cunt, or better, both of them, to hold in them mine own, and artlessly laugh with questions, has much in common with O'Hara's. Vaguely I hear the torn down sound of the 3rd Purple Avenue L. It sways slightly but firmly like a hand or a golden downed thigh. Normally I don't think of sounds as colored unless I'm feeling corrupt, concrete, Rimbaud, obscurity of emotion, which is simple and very definite. So that very headlong kind of feeling that runs over the end of the line. I don't want to take too much time, but I love so much the way this poem that I hope you know, which is "You are gorgeous and I'm coming." This poem starts out in a relatively linear fashion and then takes the reader along very quickly into an increasingly complex syntactical experience imbued with the most lovely purples and traveling. Again, his headlong nature, the way he uses language or seems to let language propel itself forward with all kinds of wild energy, not stopping, but taking the curves of the line like the train that is running in his imagination, and how that's superimposed by a very specific bedroom scene, which by the 3rd line is leading to a synesthetic experience of sex and also poetry, followed by subconsciousness or unconsciousness of a dark and purifying wave. One long sentence still hurtling and reminding you that you, the reader, are along for the ride that's never the same, of its acceleration and aggregating force, like the metro, which of course is the French for it. Are we riding with Rimbaud? And circling back to the way the train squeals around the bend of the line and goes express and then local, and how an old romance can be like a train, and still the poem is one long sentence with no period, a list toward the end that lifts up its view up to the heavens, stars all come out, we are all for the captured time of our being, which cannot be summarized. And at the same time, this is an acrostic love poem to a very specific person named Vincent Warren, whose name has been spilled on its side to generate this poem so alive in its action and linguistic splendor, its syntax of sensory overload, urban love, the permission to improvise and go on your nerve, a generative energy that makes me want to write. And the thing I want to say about acrostics, I mean, Frank O'Hara, he has the Edwin Denby acrostic, James Dean, the Vincent Warren, but the acrostic form is being an improvisatory structure, like John Coltrane's My Favorite Things. Like he'll play that tune and then he'll go off into interstellar space. So I see that improvisation happening in Frank O'Hara. So that's it. Thank you.